The story begins in a small town where love, betrayal, and greed collide with deadly consequences. This is the case of Larry Holman, his wife Temmie, and the series of men whose tangled relationships ultimately led to a murder that no one saw coming. Larry Holman was a man known for his work ethic and his reputation within his community, but behind the scenes, his marriage was anything but peaceful. His wife Temmie had her own secrets, and her desire for more love, more attention, had led her to several affairs over the years. But no one could have predicted that these affairs would turn into something far darker, a murder that would shake the very foundation of her family. This is a case filled with passion, deception, and multiple suspects, each with their own motive. When Larry was found dead, detectives began their investigation by looking at the people closest to him. The first person they focused on was Temmie herself. But what made this case more complicated was that Temmie wasn't just grieving the loss of her husband. She was involved with several other men at the time, including an old high school flame named Tim Smith. Tim and Temmie had been classmates and even dated briefly in high school. After Larry's death, Tim moved in with Temmie, which seemed suspicious to investigators. But despite the circumstances, there was nothing in Tim's past that pointed to any criminal activity. His most serious offenses were minor traffic violations. Temmie and Tim were questioned, and during the investigation, Tim confirmed he had been in a relationship with Temmie before Larry's death and had visited her often after the tragedy. He denied any involvement in the murder, but his sudden reappearance in her life raised enough suspicion to warrant further scrutiny. Then there was Tom Rumble, a man who became obsessed with Temmie after her husband's death. Tom had been sending Temmie an unsettling number of messages, calling her repeatedly, and even appearing at her home uninvited. Temmie tried to distance herself from him, even going so far as to file a restraining order. He claimed his feelings for her were real, but police found no direct evidence linking him to the murder. However, it wasn't Tom or Tim who would eventually be pinned as the killer. It was Charlie Miller, a man with whom Temmie had been having an affair. Charlie wasn't just a lover, he was also a close friend of Larry's. The two men had worked together on renovations around the house, and at one point, Charlie even showed Larry his .243 caliber hunting rifle. This would prove to be a crucial piece of evidence. Investigators learned that Charlie had been in contact with Temmie on the day of Larry's murder, and that he had recently owned a rifle of the exact same caliber that had killed Larry. It wasn't long before police seized the rifle for ballistics testing, and sure enough, it matched the bullet that killed Larry. At that point, all eyes turned to Charlie. Charlie was arrested, and after some questioning, he confessed to the crime. He admitted that he shot Larry to eliminate him as a threat to his relationship with Temmie. Charlie claimed that Larry's presence was the only thing standing between him and Temmie's love, and that he had been planning the murder for some time. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Temmie, despite the mounting evidence against her, denied having any part in the murder. She claimed that Charlie acted on his own and that she had never intended for her husband to die. She painted herself as a victim of Charlie's obsession, but the evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered text messages and phone records that showed Temmie and Charlie had been in constant contact in the days leading up to the murder. In fact, it seemed like Temmie had been encouraging Charlie, giving him information about her husband's schedule and whereabouts. Some of the messages even suggested that Temmie had incited Charlie to kill Larry, as she no longer wanted to live with her husband. When Temmie was brought in for questioning, she still denied any involvement, but the prosecution had a strong case against her. They presented evidence of her phone calls and text messages with Charlie, which showed her level of complicity in the plot. However, despite all the evidence, Temmie continued to maintain her innocence. Her defense lawyer stuck to the same argument, that Temmie was just a victim of Charlie's delusions. and that she was not involved in the murder, but it was clear that the evidence suggested otherwise. The prosecution offered Temmie a plea deal. They acknowledged that while she hadn't pulled the trigger, her role in the murder was undeniable. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Temmie agreed that the evidence against her would likely lead to a guilty verdict. Temmie was sentenced to 7 years in prison for her role in the crime. She continued to claim her innocence, calling the confession a forced measure. However, her time in prison did little to change the opinion of the public or her family. Temmie served her time and was released in 2009, but her attempts to reconnect with her children were met with cold rejection. Larry's children, now grown, could never understand why their mother didn't simply divorce their father if she was unhappy with their marriage. The question echoed in their minds: why did it have to end in murder? Temmie's life after prison was marked by isolation and a deep sense of loss. She never regained the trust of her children, and her relationships with the men she once loved faded away. As for Charlie Miller, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 2028. In the end, what we're left with is a story about deceit and betrayal, a tale of a woman who was unwilling to face the consequences of her own actions. Temmie didn't just lose her husband, she lost her family, her freedom, and her own integrity in a web of lies that spiraled out of control. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Crime Chronicles. Be sure to subscribe and join us next time as we dive into another case filled with twists and turns that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Thank you for watching.